And once again, I'd like to welcome everybody back to the Buffalo History Channel. It is so good to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us. As you can see, where things look a little bit different. This is doing something new. We're finally made the transition over to StreamYard, the StreamYard platform. Very happy about that. We still do some things on Zoom for those that don't have a StreamYard and not really acclimated to it yet. So we kind of got it going on both sides, but I'm definitely glad to be doing the StreamYard thing right about now. Um, with us today, we're going to be going in a bit of a different direction because history can come in all different types of forms. We talk about the arts and we talk about Black businesses and all. We're going to be going into we even started going to start getting into sports a little bit later on, but we're also we're going to get into some crime stories here. And one story, we already did a couple stories on the story of Sly Green with Pat Freeman. We had Pat Freeman on to talk about that. And we're going to be talking about another story here, one that I became familiar with as a child back in the day. And it was about the story of a lady by the name of Gail Trait. And I can go back to when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and just hearing that name and hearing the story behind what happened, hearing it as a child really kind of frightened me a little bit, but also kind of made me sad for the kids themselves because they weren't too much older than I was. But the story was really a tragedy. And I've brought Michelle Scott on to give us some background on it because she in her own right is a content creator on crime and channel on her channel Crime in the Margins. If she looks familiar to her, you will remember her from the story we did on the legacy of Scotty's Steakhouse, and which was a very, very popular and well-received stories, but popular and well-received story. But this is what she also does. So we're going to be talking about something different today. Michelle, welcome back to the Buffalo History Channel.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me back on, Doug.
Absolutely. So for those that may know, you can remind them. And for those that don't know, can you give us the background on the story of Gail Trait?
Yes. So I came in contact with this story. So this took place in 1978, and I was about 3 at the time. So I don't personally remember the story, but I love to watch true crime. Right. And at the time, I was thinking about starting my channel, and I happened one late night when I was watching true crime to relax, because I'm one of those people that watches true crime to relax. I came across the Gail Trait story, and it was just a brief video. It wasn't very detailed about the story, but it was, of course, interesting to me because it took place in Buffalo, not too far from where I live right now. Like, I can literally walk to Montana Street now from where I live. And so it was very interesting to me. And so I started doing some reading about Gail Trait and what had happened with her children. Now, this was interesting to me for a number of reasons because I'm a social worker. And so this particular case was truly under a social work umbrella. And it was just intriguing to me how so many of the systems failed these children, right? And so I got caught up into reading about it. There's a cop who was Buffalo police who actually wrote an entire book on the case. And the book is housed at the Buffalo History Museum. So you can't even, I tried to get it online from Amazon. You can't even buy this book anymore. It's not in print. Okay. So I went out and made an appointment with the Buffalo History Museum to go through their archives and find out about the Gail Trait story and get the real nitty gritty on it. Because a lot of times when you watch it on YouTube, they leave a lot of stuff out, which this is the case for this particular story. There were so many nuanced details to this particular story that it just took me down a rabbit hole. And so Gail Trait was the mother of 4 children living in Buffalo, New York. She originally was living on Victoria Street, which is in our Central Park area location, and she was living there alone with her 4 children. And then something happened with her ability to stay in that apartment. And so she moved with her mother on Montana Street. Now, it's important to note that
Let's say
Gail moved.
I was going to say Montana was at the time we were living on Northumberland, so we were she was literally a block away from us at that time.
Yeah. And Montana Street at that time was still, you started to have Black families move in, but there were still a lot of white families in the
Yes.
neighborhood, right? Because
Yeah.
now that area is completely African American, or you might have like Bengali families or Pakistani families or even families from Yemen now in that community. But back then, you really didn't have a lot of Black families living in that neighborhood. And so, yes, you're right. Northumberland was not far from Montana Street. Gail moved in with her. So the murders took place, and my memory might be failing me, but the murders took place on a Sunday night. Gail had just moved in with her mother that Saturday before the murders took place. So she hadn't even been at the Montana Street location that long. And it's really sad because her children, originally Gail had given her children over to Erie County Department of Social Services because she felt that she couldn't take care of them. There were a lot of things going on with her, and she just felt that they would be better off with someone else. Now, what I couldn't find out, well, I did find out a little because the oldest daughter, her father was not the same as the younger 3 children. And so her oldest daughter, I believe his name was Joseph Persons. He did want to get his daughter out of Erie County Department of Social Services, the child protection portion. But they did not let him for a number of reasons. They said that he was having financial issues, and back then it was just really kind of unheard of for a man to be a single father. And so Child Protective Services did not let him take her. And then I believe they were in the custody of Child Protective Services for a little over a month, almost a month. And then Gail requested her children back. And so I believe the murders, and Doug, I apologize, I forgot the dates, but I believe the murders took place in May, late May. And so she had gotten the children back approximately about 10 days before the murders actually took place.
Wow.
And so it was, there was a lot going on. Gail had gone to a party. It was a wedding party for a friend of the family that was getting married, and she went, her boyfriend went, and her mother went as well. And her boyfriend pulled her mom aside and said that she had been talking really strange, as he called it, about that she was going to harm the children, that, she had to save their souls, and that this was going to take place. So he reported it to her mom, and her mom kind of blew it off because she said Gail had been acting normally the whole time. So she didn't really think anything of it. So after that night at the wedding party, I believe that was a Friday night, the next day, which was Saturday, or no, that was actually the Saturday night. I apologize. That was the Saturday night when she moved into her mom's house. They went to a wedding party that night. The next day on Sunday, her boyfriend, I believe his name was Ernest, he came back and was knocking on her door because she was in the upstairs apartment. Now, living downstairs was her landlady. And she heard Ernest come back. He was knocking on the door. Gail didn't answer. He left. And then a few hours later, he came back again and was knocking on her door, and she didn't answer. Now, the landlady did take note of this. She thought that maybe they were having a lover's quarrel or some type of spat, and that's why Gail didn't open the door. But really, Ernest was concerned about what she had been saying about the children, and he had gone over there twice that day to check on her. Now, he was a cab driver, so, again, the landlady saw him pull up in his cab, do these things, but then after he left the second time, he didn't return. And so there was a woman who lived across the street who was visiting the landlady downstairs from Gail. And it had to be about 11:30 that night. She was still hanging out with the landlady, and they started to hear this commotion upstairs. And the thing is, the lady from across the street, I believe her name was Mrs. Jones. I'd have to go back and look again, but I believe her name was Mrs. Jones. She wanted to go upstairs and check on what was happening because she said the children were screaming. And she talked about how it was a different type of scream, right? It was blood curdling. But the landlady was like, no, don't go up there. Mind your own business. Stay out of there. That's none of our business what's going on. And the reason why the landlady said this is because she thought that Gail was just disciplining the children. But Mrs. Jones noted, she was like, yeah, that sounds a little bit like, beyond discipline, because the children were screaming so much. And again, it was just these blood curdling screams. And so after the commotion calmed down, the lady from across the street, Mrs. Jones, went and knocked on the door for upstairs because she was just like, I need to check. I need to figure out what's going on if they need some help, right? So she knocked on the door, and she knocked for a while. And eventually Gail stumbled to the door, opened it. And when she answered the door, she was like, you're not my mom. And then she fell out of the door onto Mrs. Jones. And Mrs. Jones started screaming because Gail was covered in blood. And, Mrs. Jones was trying to figure out what was going on. But at this point, Gail had stumbled out the door and fell on her. And the landlady came to the door, to see what was going on, because now it was even more commotion going on outside on the front porch. And so that's when Mrs. Jones told the landlady to call the police. And the police came. They got an ambulance there first because they thought initially that Gail was injured, that because she was covered in so much blood, they thought that she was injured. And so the ambulance came and took her to Erie County Medical Center, which is our level 1 trauma center here in Buffalo. Right. And it's not far from the Montana Street location. And so they took her over there. In the meantime, the police started to arrive at the house. And initially what was thought was that Ernest had come back. The landlady thought that maybe Ernest came back and they missed him, and that Ernest and Gail had gotten into an argument and he physically harmed her. So when the police entered the apartment, they were on full caution because they thought Ernest might still be up there. And so they entered the apartment and, they started to walk through. And once they got into the living room, that's when they saw the first 2 bodies of the children. I believe it was Gail's oldest daughter and then her 6-year-old were in the front living room. And I believe the oldest daughter had been stabbed 63 times. The 6-year-old had been stabbed like 44 times. And, of course, that took the police off guard. They were very shocked at the brutality at which the children had been murdered. As they continued to make their way through the house, that's when they arrived in the kitchen and they saw the other daughter. I believe she was 4. I believe her name was Inez. And Inez had been stabbed brutally as well. I believe she had one of her limbs severed. And then they found her 2-year-old son in the kitchen. And Gail had severed several of his limbs, and she had also removed his eyes from the socket and placed them in a bowl on the kitchen table. She also had several bowls of their blood on the kitchen table. And originally there was an officer who reported that he saw voodoo paraphernalia, right? So voodoo dolls and candles and things that people would utilize in a voodoo ritual. And that's how this became known as the voodoo murders of Buffalo, New York. It was later said that by another officer that there was no voodoo paraphernalia. So, we don't really know if there was or if there wasn't. But because there was an officer who said that, we think that there may have been. At the hospital, they cleaned Gail up and she had no injuries whatsoever. So that's when they started to realize, wait a minute, she has no injuries. The children are murdered. That's when they started to put two and two together that Gail had actually committed this crime. And she kept saying in the hospital that she did it to save her children's soul. And so it was a very brutal murder. It was very sad, right? Because the children had only been back in her custody for, I think, about 10 days at the time. And, you know, the system failed these children. They failed Gail because she was later diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, which makes sense because as a therapist, I know that schizophrenia, the typical onset for women is somewhere around age 26 to 32. And so Gail was in that age range. I believe at the time she was 27 or 28. And so that would have been around the time for typical onset of paranoid schizophrenia. And if anyone knows about paranoid schizophrenia, people hear voices, they see things that we will say are not there, but for them is very real. And so it's just, again, very sad that the children had to endure, this brutal attack by their mother. And so Gail Trait was sentenced to 10 years in jail. Well, she was sentenced and served 10 years in jail. And then after that, she was released, or wait, let me take that back. She was released to a psychiatric ward. That's where she actually spent the 10 years. So I think she only did a short time in actual jail. And then she was released to a psychiatric ward where she did her 10 years. She was released and Gail came back out into the community. I believe they said she was medicated and she was doing well. Last I knew when I was doing the research, she had moved to Seneca Falls, New York and gotten remarried. They didn't say if she had any more children or not, though. I don't believe that she did. I don't think she had any more children, but she did get out and get remarried. And last I knew, she was living in Seneca Falls, New York, which is just, I would say, maybe an hour and some change outside of Buffalo. So it's not too far. But she said that she couldn't come back to Buffalo because it was just too hard for her.
Wow.
I know.
Yeah. I mean, I can. I don't have a lot of clear memories of it because again I was just very young at the time myself, a little older than a few of her children, and I can remember a little bit of the word about it getting around in the neighborhood, not a lot but a little bit. And I think what it and I hadn't really it hadn't really been on my radar throughout my later life until I didn't come back on. I did stumble across the story back in the mid 90s when I was producing my first documentary on the Build organization, and I did come across a few articles where members of Build spoke out on it, as well as in her defense. And so that's kind of when it kind of reminded me. Oh yeah, I remember that. But I think what it also speaks to is something that we had that in our community we really hadn't been acknowledging at the time, which was the whole subject as a whole of mental health.
Yes.
We were very dismissive of it back then.
I think we're still very dismissive of it now. I think more people, I definitely think since the pandemic, more people take it seriously, just because a lot of people were thrust into just dealing with it. But I think as a community, we historically have been told, go to church, pray, do those things, and, let God make it better. And, don't make no mistake, I'm with that as well. But as a therapist, I'm also with medication, right? If you have cancer, you typically have no problems going to get chemo and radiation and trying to save your life. And so I view medication with mental health the same way. But, back then, mental health was treated differently for everyone. It just, I don't think it was just us. I think just back then they just didn't take it seriously. And even when they did, nobody really wanted to admit that they were having problems because back then they put people in institutions and locked them in padded rooms, never to be spoken to or heard from again.
Yeah, nobody wanted to go there.
Nobody wanted to go there. if you've ever been to Buffalo and you've seen the Buffalo Psychiatric Center, you know you don't want to go there,
Haven't
right?
been there, but I've heard. I've heard
Yes.
about it.
I've been there several times, and it's not a place I ever like to go, not working, not visiting, not anything, just because mental health is still treated like you did something wrong. It's
Right.
not treated like cancer. And unfortunately, it's the same thing, right? Cancer attacks various organs in your body, and mental health attacks the chemicals in your brain. And when things just aren't working right or synapses aren't firing properly, you can develop a condition such as paranoid schizophrenia.
I think another contributing factor, which has made our community a little bit more aware of the importance and effects of mental health, has been the advent of social media.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think highlighting stories like the Gail Trait story is important because, right, when we don't look at history, we have a tendency to repeat history, right?
Mhm.
Repeat the things that happen in history. And so that was one of the reasons why I did the Gail Trait story. My channel's called Crime in the Margins because I really look at crime against marginalized people. And this came up for me when the Gabby Petito case was going on and how much coverage it got compared to a lot of people who are considered unimportant due to the color of their skin or other various aspects of their life. And these stories don't get enough coverage. And so I wanted to bring that to life and really cover stories about people who are marginalized in our community who are not getting any coverage about their story. And so Gail Trait was my first story on my channel because it was close to home. It's Buffalo. And I was very shocked to find out that we had a case like this. As we know, it would not be our last highly sensationalized case. But again, it was an important case for us, or definitely for me to discuss as a social worker. Because I talk to parents all the time who are going through various, hardships in their life, and things happen. And a lot of times, parents feel bad when they say, I just don't think that I'm in a space right now where I can care for my children. And, these parents, I've been in places where I've been accompanying a parent at court or something, and people just treat them horribly. And, I think it would make people not want to report that they're having a problem. And if that happens, you can have another person who ends up like Gail Trait, or, the children end up like Gail Trait's children because we're not paying attention to the signs and the cues, and, we're blowing off what they say. And really, it's important to take every word that someone says seriously, especially when it comes to them saying that they're going to harm their children or them saying that they don't feel that they're fit. I also think it's important to note that Gail Trait requested her children back because once she gave them over to the system, they cut her benefits. So she was getting what we called it welfare back then. People still call it welfare, but technically it's called temporary assistance to needy families. And then we have SNAP now, so supplemental nutrition, right? Back then it was just called food stamps. So they cut her food stamps, they cut her medical, they cut her money. And she was in school at ECC studying to be a nurse. And so, I had a lot of people in my comments when I did this story who were like, yeah, she was lazy. She needed to go back to work. She wanted to live off of people's tax dollars. I had my thoughts about those statements because at one time Gail did work, and we all work and we all pay our taxes into that system. So it's there when we need to utilize it. It's a safety net system. That's what we call it as social workers. That's what the government programs calls it. So I think, there used to be a time when a person could do something and they would have their benefits for 90 days until they made a transition. Um, because they immediately cut her off because the children were no longer in the home. I think, again, the systems failed all of these people because they, first of all, should have, you know, uh, incentivized her to get some help, which may have been keeping her benefits until she got a 72-hour, psychiatric evaluation that could have been helpful. But there were so many, intersections of things happening at the time. Her losing the benefits, her losing her medical care. They were going to take her funding for school. And the thing is, how does one better themselves if you pull all of those things? And it did incentivize her to request her children back, but she wasn't well. She wasn't mentally well at the time. And so there are just so many things, so many places where people drop the ball with these children and with Gail. And again, that's why this story was so important to me, because I still see it happening in many of the systems that people with mental illness navigate today.
Yeah, we do still, hear stories,
Mm-hmm.
throughout the country, and throughout
Yes.
communities all over the country where women have, killed their children for not for the reasons that she did. They said
Right.
she did, but for other reasons that they most can't handle the responsibility
Mm-hmm.
of having a child.
It's a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
A huge responsibility.
And
And
oh,
even people who have been mentally well their entire life, you
right.
find that women have children and then they start going through postpartum depression. And it's very well possible. They did note that it was possible that Gail had suffered postpartum depression after she had her children, which would, contribute to the onset of her paranoid schizophrenia. Now, make no mistake, typically paranoid schizophrenia is something that is in a person already. It could be hereditary. It's usually, again, in the lineage. And so it's something that when they hit that age range, they'll develop. But if there's other things happening, it can speed up the onset of that condition manifesting itself in the person. And so if she was suffering with postpartum depression, which wasn't taken seriously, I'll be honest, I don't feel like it was taken seriously until a few years ago, because even when Andrea Yates murdered her 5 children in her home, they had said that she had postpartum. She reported she was also diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. She had reported that the devil was talking to her and told her to murder her children. And so there's a lot of similarities between Gail Trait and Andrea Yates, even though they were easily 30 years apart, right? And so we see these stories again and again. And so again, I thought it was just important to talk about that story because Andrea Yates got a lot of news coverage. It was really sparked a conversation about, moms and the help they need. But many times I don't feel like Black women get that same courtesy, that same empathy, right? That other women in the community get, other non-Black women get. And this is just Black people in general, right? I think Black people in general catch a lot of grief that, when other people do it who are not Black, there's this, level of understanding and empathy and sympathy that you just don't see Black people receive when it comes to dealing with systems in the community.
One of the things that I came across and was struck by is that just in preparing for this interview, when I was doing the research that I did, I could see that the community seemed to really be
Mm-hmm.
backing her and just saying that
Yes.
that there had to be something more than
Mm-hmm.
just some sort of a ritualistic killing.
Right.
Mm.
And the thing is, they said that Gail and her family dabbled in what they called black magic in the book, voodoo. Um, I mean, it's really given a bad rap, right? Voodoo is very much I think a lot of people fail to realize that historically voodoo was a religion practiced in West Africa, right? We brought it with us when we were enslaved and brought over here against our will, right? I always talk about how it's interesting when you go to the Statue of Liberty. Black people are the only group of people that are not listed as immigrants because we never immigrated here. We were taken and brought here against our will.
Mhm.
With that, we brought our religious practices, which were whitewashed away from us with Christianity and things like that. And so, I think, as with anything, there can be a bad side and a good side. So to automatically assume that if her family had voodoo practices, these could have been things that were handed down to them through generations. You'll often see Black folks in America practice hoodoo, right? Hoodoo was a mix between voodoo and the Native American spirituality practices. And I get people who'll say, well, if you indulge in that, you get what you deserve. But you'd be surprised how many Black folks turn the broom upside down in front of their door. Or if someone sweeps their feet, they throw salt over their shoulder. Or they eat black eyed peas and collard greens on New Year's Eve. And all of
Right,
these are hoodoo practices. They may not know that they're hoodoo practices, but they're rooted in that legacy from our religious practices that we brought with us from Africa, right? And so to villainize her and automatically say that, well, because she was engaging in voodoo practices, we know that she was going to murder her children is just not true. Because you'd be surprised how many Black households still practice voodoo, and it literally is a religion for them. They're not out doing all these nefarious things that people associate with voodoo. So I like to highlight that because I don't want people being villainized for their particular religious practices that may not, align with the mainstream religious practices that we have now, that again were not our original religious practices when our ancestors were over in Africa. So we weren't practicing Christianity back then. So, if Gail and her family did that, again, nobody else in her family murdered their children. So I would beg to, say that it was more the paranoid schizophrenia than it was her actual voodoo practices, if
okay.
she did engage any, right? Because this is alleged. Allegedly, she engaged in that.
Okay. So before we land the plane on this piece, talk to us about more about your platform, Crime in the Margins. Any other stories we can look for on there?
You can look for stories, Doug. I'm so super busy. I do too much. I do way too much because I
I
have
understand.
my my Social Work Entrepreneur Academy YouTube channel. I just started another YouTube channel called Eating Buffalo. Um, I do like Crime in the Margins, and I will do more videos, but I'll be honest with you, that one took a lot out of me. It energetically, emotionally, it took a
Yeah.
lot out of me. So watching true crime is one thing, researching true crime so you can create your own stories is another, because you're so immersed into the content when you're doing the research process that it literally drained me so much. I was really kind of out of it for a couple weeks. So that's something that I will do more of. I do have some other stories that I want to cover. Um, I definitely want to cover the mass shooting at Tops here in Buffalo, but that's still a scab right now and not a scar. And
That's for the same situation for all of us. I
yeah,
haven't done much with that except for
no,
the one video that I shot when I was happened to be down there just days after the incident took place.
yeah, that's still to this day when I ride past. I've not been back at that supermarket, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to go back. But even when I still ride past, it's still very heavy, right? The energy over there feels very heavy. So it'll
Yeah.
be a while before I cover that story again, because I don't, I always tell people I don't cover stories unless they're a scar. If they're a scab, right? They're still healing. Um, I don't cover them yet until it'll never be fully healed, but one day it'll be a scar and it probably won't be as heavy for me to go over there and, possibly talk to the families and things like that. Because I did personally know one of the people who were murdered at that location. So,
As did I. Yeah.
yeah, still very, very sad. It's almost 2 years later. So,
Yeah, I've been in there a few times when I've been back in the cities, and even then, it's that feeling that it's very very heavy, very heavy.
Yes. Yes, I agree.
But I want to thank you for being once again rejoining us on the Buffalo History Channel. We certainly were looking to have you back at another time as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. If I ever get this steakhouse back open, boy, they make it
Yes.
hard to open a restaurant, boy. They make it hard. You got to jump
Well,
through a lot of hoops. So
well,
I'm
I told
working on it.
I told you I was on Facebook and saw somebody making a post about how how she was looking for a steak sandwich that had that Scotty steak that Scotty's appeal to it. So, I
Listen,
almost tagged you in it, but I said no. Let me I know
I
she.
don't. Yeah, because you remember the time I had two random people just show up at my front door at 10 a.m. talk about where can I get a steak sandwich. I'm like, wait, what?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In what world do they do this, sir? I was
Mhm.
asleep.
Uh-huh.
So
I didn't
that
want to
was
do
a
that
little
to you.
scary.
All right. But I'd like to thank you for joining us on the Buffalo History Channel,
Absolutely.
and we'll catch you on the next one.
Absolutely, Doug. Thank you for having me on.
All right.